to adjust the title because we haven't quite beaten COVID when I was being in an optimistic mood when I was asked for the title. So I changed it to We're Beating COVID, now can we do the same for cancer? And in a gloomy year, I hope I'm going to leave you with a sense of real optimism as to where we are in that particular story. So if we move on to the next slide.
Okay, well, so why am I optimistic? Because these are the gloomy headline figures that we have for the United Kingdom. 375,000 cases of cancer, that's an annual number. Death rate per annum is 166,000. So think of all the COVID deaths and cram that into 1 year. That's the death rate from cancer in the United Kingdom. Good news, since 1970, we have moved from 1 in 4 to 2 in 4 surviving 10 years or more with cancer. Now, for all intents and practical purposes, we consider a 10-year span as being more or less related to cure, but it's not an absolute cure. It's basically saying you can live a normal lifespan with cancer. You may still need treatment. And our belief is that 38% of all cancers in the United Kingdom are actually still preventable in what we're able to undertake. And it is the leading cause of death. I'm not going to get into body bag counts, but the truth is, if you take heart disease and stroke, that's slightly ahead in terms of death rate over cancer, but only just. But the next one is, if we move on one, is even more worrying, because that number for the UK alone by 2035 will rise to 576,000 cases of cancer, or to put it more meaningfully, from 1 in 3 of us having a lifetime experience personally of cancer, it will be 1 in 2. 50% of us in this room will get cancer. End of. That's immutable. Even if the world stops smoking tomorrow, this is all to do with aging populations. It's nothing to do with any particular carcinogen. Those are the major factors. So we have a problem. We have a pandemic in COVID terms, but actually it's a hidden pandemic. Can we move on to the next slide? There is going to be no change in the spectrum of cancers till the mid-2030s. So it'll be the same types of cancer that we're seeing today. It's just there will be more of them, slightly fewer changes in relation to breast, with lung expanding in women. That's the historic effect of women taking up more smoking. But that's about the only marginal change that we're going to see. So same spectrum, same pattern. Good news for the NHS. Next slide, please. So if we're going to be optimistic and we pick that 10-year target, what does that mean? For 3 in 4 to survive, which is the target that Cancer Research UK is setting for the UK by 2034, it's all right, it's a nice little jingle, 3 in 4 to live 10 years or more by 2034. Whether we'll hit 2034, I don't know. I probably won't be there to find out. But if we move on to the next slide, it gives you some idea of where we are. Virtually all of the cancers are well below that target line at present. But there is some optimism that many are catching up to this target. The best news on that is breast cancer. If you have the unfortunate habit of picking up breast cancer, the good news is you are now better off being treated by the NHS in Britain than in the United States or France or Australia, which are the normal comparator countries. It's the first time the NHS has actually overtaken outcomes in those countries related to cancer. So I think all of those dealing with breast cancer need a huge round of applause for achieving that. But these are on the way. And some of you who are eagle-eyed and can spot, there are some cancers not on there at all because there's virtually no survival. Even 20 or 30 years of research, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, brain tumors. We don't find them on this screen at all. And so we have some real areas that are very difficult to treat cancer. And you'll see lung right down the bottom there with some reason for optimism. 5 years ago, they wouldn't have even figured on that slide. So we're making some progress in these difficult to treat cancers. Okay, you may well again say, why am I so optimistic then that we're actually on the route to beating cancer? So let's move on. COVID's had its impact on cancer. If I could move on, one more. So what I'm going to show you in the COVID slide is that the real impact of COVID has been a huge decrease in the first year of COVID in terms of diagnostic procedures. 4.92 million diagnostic procedures were not carried out. 3.9 million of those in radiology. These are cancer diagnostic procedures. We estimate that in that year, there were something like 45,000 undiagnosed cancers that we would expect to see on the numbers, and that's not even projecting for the year-on-year increase that we're actually expecting. And what we would expect to see as these have not started treatment, they are going to present much later because they're not treated for 380,000 fewer cancer referrals in the first year. Let's move on to the next part. So there's been a recovery since then to March 2021 because of the heroic work undertaken by the NHS. But there are still, in 1 month, 15,000 fewer referrals for cancer than there were, and 5 to 10 times more patients waiting beyond 6 weeks to start treatment. But if you want the really scary slide, it's the one that comes at the bottom. Now, you're not going to see the detail of this, but what is happening here is if you follow the lines as to the stage of cancer that we're actually diagnosing, what's happened is it's the earlier stages that we're not picking up. And so what's happening is we're going to be seeing cancers later, and therefore the long-term consequences of that are going to be shorter survival rates in relationship to those cancers. So there's a failure in that early diagnosis, that first referral point, which I'm not blaming anyone in the NHS who are dealing with a national crisis, but it's one that they have to step up to just when they're under extreme pressure. So this isn't a slide to blame anyone, it's just the fact as to why we have to work so hard to ensure catch-up. So let's move on. Why am I so optimistic? Moving on. We now get to a fairly complex slide, and I'm going to have to take you through why cancer. How do we see cancer? Most of us will see cancer in terms of the anatomical location where the cancer is found, the prostate or the breast or ovary or brain or pancreas or esophagus. And for the NHS, because of the local complications of cancers, they have to be managed that way and always will be managed that way. In research terms, we've stopped thinking about where the cancer is. What we're actually following is this model, which is that cancer is basically a disease of failure to prevent mutations in normal cells occurring. It's a DNA disease, and the more times you divide a cell, the more likelihood it is to get to produce errors, despite our fantastic proofreading machinery. Just think of every cell that lines your gut. Every 4 days, a cell is created here and moves to the top and is then shed. And think of all the cells of your gut, and they all fall off, and they replicate every 4 days. I work that out for the average lifespan of 82 years. You can work out how many cell divisions actually have to take place. Miracle is we don't all get cancers, and they are, in that context, much rarer than you may actually think when something goes wrong. And in the bowel, when it goes wrong, we get a polyp. And this is due to a first mutation, a driver mutation that usually happens in an epithelial cell, and it doesn't fall off, but it grows into this polypoid structure. That continues to mutate and change and becomes a complex polyp with different areas and different mutations in different parts of this one polyp. And eventually this begins to invade when the mutations become rapid, and that's the so-called Vogelstein model. He got a Nobel Prize for doing that, and it forms the basis of our thinking of all cancers. So then a fantastic piece of work was done. What we did was to take all cancers in the United States and then to sequence them all. And then ask the question, are there commonalities in which mutations come up in cancer? Because if it's just private mutations and it can be random through the whole genome, we better give up on this because there's just not enough drugs or money in the world to be able to tackle it. Well, if we move on, there's the good news. There are actually only 300 of these driver mutations in 300 genes. Now that might seem a lot, but when you start with a whole genome, which, as you know, makes even the Old and New Testament look really tiny, that is a huge advance. But now let's get even more optimistic and move on to the next panel. Don't even expect you to try to see this, but it's there as an aid memoir for me. Against these 300, we already have in trial, if you click on, already 57% of these mutations already have a specific drug in trial for to tackle or to block the effect of that mutation. So there's going to be an absolute panoply of drugs coming along in the next 10 years that are going to need testing, and that's going to be another problem, but I'm not even going to get into that today. The optimistic reason is there is help on the way, and much maligned, I'm going to say a lot of it's from the pharmaceutical industry that have invested an awful lot. Why are they invested in it? And that is because the profits on cancer drugs are huge. And before you want to throw bricks at them, just remember there is no public system that is capable of delivering it. So if you don't like the private system, buy yourself a long spoon because you're going to have to suck with that devil. Move on. So targeted treatments are on the way. Okay, next one, please. Can we diagnose cancers earlier and therefore improve the chances of diagnosis? And this is the conundrum for us. If we move on to the next one. This is what it looks like. If you can diagnose even lung cancer at an early stage, 4 in 10 will actually be cured. You pick it up at the stages we're normally picking it up at the moment, 1 in 10 at best. That's why it's such a small number. Bowel cancer, pick it up early on the screening tests. If you involve yourself in the screening test, 9 in 10, even when diagnosed, are going to survive 10 years because you pick it up that early. Wait till you appear with obstruction in the casualty department, 1 in 10. So there's a real reason for doing it, and the type of treatment that you need, where surgery becomes very important in early stage disease. Later on, it's more drug treatment to halt progression and helping you to live with that cancer for longer. But there is a problem. We're all hearing about DNA tests in the blood. Let's have the next slide. This is work done in Cambridge by Rebecca Fitzgerald's group. What this is looking at is 1 square millimeter of your esophagus. So this is from the test that she was doing with the cytosponge and pulling the sponge up through the area. This is a side product. Every single one of these dots shows a cell with a driver mutation in it. This person is 20 to 23-year-old male and a non-smoker. And already in 1 square millimeter, there are these driver mutation changes. If you happen to be a smoker, and more in our age group at 68 to 71, thankfully this is for a non-smoker, this is for non-smoker, and this is a heavy smoker. You can see how many of these mutations are actually occurring. So the conundrum, if you do all of these DNA tests on the blood, how do you know you're not just picking up normal mutations? Because if that's the number of changes that are seen in the normal esophagus, these people do not have cancer in any shape or form. What is it in the body that's controlling that and preventing it from spread? Don't know, it's a big question. But the fact we've recognized it and we can adapt the tests to it means we can pick up the relatively rare event where this begins to progress. So what we're now looking at is the progression is a rare event from a mutation, not a common event. And so you're back into that rarity area. Moving on. But we can also improve our screening if we have the will to pay more for it. The normal fecal screen that we're all invited to participate in, this is the cutoff point, 120 micrograms per gram of hemoglobin detected in the stool. This means we detect 4,700 cancers and we find 17,000 advanced adenomas. Those are the ones that are likely to go malignant, but it requires 58,000 colonoscopies. If we drop the threshold, and it's an arbitrary threshold, to 80 micrograms per gram, as is done in Scotland, We would now pick up 5,800 early cancers, 24,000 adenomas, but it would mean 81,000 endoscopies. The NHS in England does not have the capacity to do 81,000 colonoscopies. So how much are you going to invest in this as opposed to dementia care, as opposed to hip replacements, as opposed to orthopedics, in order to detect 1,000 extra cancers? I'm glad I'm not Secretary of State for Health. Okay, move on. So can we develop measures to aid in cancer prevention? Let's be really optimistic. Can we stop the thing happening in the first place? Smoking. Don't listen to any politician who can tell you that it will not have an effect. This is the smoking rates since the 1960s, 70s. I would have been up here as a smoker and stopped obviously at the massive point of the decline. Every single major reduction that has occurred has not occurred because of any public health message that has been put out. It has occurred because the government has lavished tax on cigarettes. So they can make a difference. Now we're getting to the point, if they put more tax on, it doesn't lower the rate of smoking, it just increases the rate of smuggling of cigarettes into the country. These people are addicted. Nicotine is as addictive a substance as heroin, and we have to treat them as individuals who actually need support, whereas what we're doing is we're reducing all smoking support, reduction support centres, because that's what councils can't afford to keep going. So this is making a big impact. If we move on one, what you will notice is by 2030, if we continue the same rate of decline, the most common association with cancer will be obesity. But obesity poses its own challenges. If we move on to the next slide. It's only associated with 13 cancers, and yet it will become the commonest cause of development. Why does it cause? It's a complete and utter black box. Sorry, it's my biggest message in cancer research UK is actually find out what on earth is going on. Why is it that breast premenopausally is a risk factor with obesity? Postmenopausal is protective. Lung, obesity seems to be protective rather than causative. If we can identify the causality and why that physiological change, potentially completely new treatments become available. It's a huge conundrum, and it's just brushed off because obesity will cause it. But remember, it's only 13 cancers. And the one that's particularly, it will have a big impact on is bowel cancer. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to change direction a little bit. I'm going to move to an individual called Ferdinand Hodler. No reason you should think you know him. Ferdinand Hodler was a painter, a Swiss painter, painted a very famous picture in 1890 that was banned for obscenity, but it's much like the Schiller pictures of 40 years later. Beautiful pictures now seen in the Geneva Gallery. But that isn't the reason I picked on Hodler. Hodler was married twice. He's a painter who painted in this style called parallelism. He believed in the symmetry of life and society and wanted to display this in his pictures. But he was also a gifted portrait painter. And in 1908, he met and fell in love with Valentine Goeder-Darel, who became his mistress and bore him a child, Pauline. He still carried on living with his second wife. I'm not sure if any of you this sort of arrangement for me, but I suspect most of you would not, but clearly they have a more bohemian lifestyle at that stage. Tragically, she developed abdominal pain and fell ill in 1914, and she was diagnosed with a gynecological malignancy. Now, Hodler was obsessive. In 1916, he painted 23 self-portraits of himself in different moods. He became quite depressed in later life. But he chose as his subject Valentine Goeder-Darel. And it has led to some quite tragic images, but they're very important because they personalize the journey that a patient then took with gynecological malignancy. And the next picture is her after her first operative procedure in June of 1914, where she was recovering, but optimism was still there. If you go on to the next one, here she is after a second procedure in September, and this is her in December with the cancer having spread. And if we carry on, I'm afraid the series becomes even more area. This picture here entitled Turning Your Face to the Wall, something that you see very often happening with patients. And the last was painted 24 hours before her death. He then proceeded to paint at least 6 images of her on her deathbed before burial, and he was like more completely obsessed with the family reaction to death. But nevertheless, he's left this amazing legacy of one woman's journey with cancer in 1915. Moving on. So what can we do to reduce the burden of this condition? We forget that cervical cancer was a killer. Ada Lovelace, the famous woman, she died of cervical cancer. Read her son's diaries as he lived with her during that last day if you really want to depress yourself. But we need to reduce this incidence of this disease, particularly in poor countries. So we've had cervical smears done in this country, good uptake, 85%. Virtually all cervical cancers are now found in the 15% who do not turn up for smears. Okay, moving on. We need easier technologies, and we did a trial of one. Can we move on? A visual inspection of the cervix in Thailand and India. Had a 40% impact. This is just visualizing the cervix, training women in villages to be able to do that so that you keep men away from this altogether, make it very much a women's problem. That did not have the biggest impact. The biggest impact was women suddenly became aware that postmenopausal bleeding was a symptom and was not a return to fertility. I'm sorry, we may find that strange, but it's actually quite well seen in poorer countries that is a particular area. And the good news for cervix is even if you detect it in the early invasive stages, such a slowly progressing disease, surgery is very often curative. And that's why it was tried on Godet Durrell. But now, if we move on, we are now abandoning cytology, moving to HPV testing, where we only test for the presence and persistence of the virus that causes this disorder. And the good news is, if we move on to the next one, soon it'll be routine to do this by liquid biopsy, so we don't even have to take the smears themselves in that area. But I also believe that will become available as an over-the-counter test that women can do themselves for boots or elsewhere. And the technology is already there, it's going under trials. Now, why am I optimistic for this particular disease? Well, it's caused by this little piece, human papillomavirus. 99.6% of all cases of cervical cancer are caused by this virus. Some of us might remember there was a fad when it was going to be herpes simplex that was going to be the cause of it. Forget that. This is the beastie that causes it. 99.6, stronger than smoking and lung cancer in its association. This one is not a virus. This was created in the test tube. The virus has got 7 proteins in it altogether, and 2 of them, L1 and L2, make up this crystalline structure. And what a very gifted Australian friend of mine, Ian, did in Brisbane, and repeated also at NCI, is to just take those 2 genes, L1 and L2, and stick them into another cell. And then we move to the miracle of chemistry. If you make the concentration of these 2 proteins heavy enough inside a cell, out comes that. It looks exactly like the virus. And that's because it self-assembles like a crystal into the virus shape. So the question arose, could we now stick that into people, and would that provide protection against cervical cancer? We wanted to add a further one because we were interested in having a treatable system, but that's a part of the history. We're involved now in the question of would this work? It was done in dog papillomavirus, which is one reason why we still need to do animal experimentation. The show papillomavirus of rabbits had to be tested, and the duration of protection was something we need to look at. And would it protect at the site of the cervix. Let's remember, we are talking about 1 square millimeter of surface area, which is the transition zone of the cervix that is actually affected. So would a vaccine that is administered actually protect? And if it protected, how long would it protect for? Next slide, please. First trials were done in Seattle by Laura Kutsky. Forget the top bit, but the bottom bit basically showed that in 100 per 100 women years in the vaccine group, no cases of pre-invasive cancer were detected, whereas in the control group, 3.8 were detected. And there were 41 cases in the placebo group alone, not a single case in the group. This was done in young women, and therefore it was a trial that was done, so their exposure rate was likely to be very high to papillomavirus, because Laura's previous work showed that every woman from the onset of sexual activity within 9 months has almost certainly been exposed to papillomavirus. And before you run away and start thinking condoms, condoms are not as effective against papillomavirus as they are against HIV. So it's a much smaller beast. So it looked pretty good. And so we then drove this into the population. I'll answer some questions that you may have about the vaccine refuseniks and all of the campaigns, the round tables, the interviews, the radio interviews, the television interviews with these groups later on. But 2 weeks ago, this is the data. Move on to the next slide. If we look at the British population, and this is our data, of women from 1941 through to 1990, there was no offer of a vaccine to those women. So this is cohort 4, so you'll need to remember. From then on, in different cohorts, different numbers and different age groups were vaccinated. Firstly, 16 to 18-year-olds, then 14 to 16-year-olds, school years 10 and 11. Then we dropped down from between 1995 to 1999, down to the age of 8. The coverage has also increased from 60% now up to nearly 90% coverage at the age of 8. Now, that's an awful word, but we're not supposed to use it. Our glorious leader has told us that herd immunity is no longer to be used. Herd immunity is a scientific fact. Whatever he may view in terms of his lexicon, he cannot actually deny that it actually is. And that is close to the level of herd immunity, where now we're vaccinating boys as well, which is the vector. We've got every opportunity now to block the transmission of this agent. And this is what we're seeing. This is the where we're looking at the number of cases of invasive cervical cancer that have been detected in this group to begin with, cohort 4. So that's what you would expect with no vaccination. Even that preliminary vaccination has dropped that down quite considerably. And the more you go on, the projected numbers are there, and not a single case has been detected in this cohort from 1999. And if you look at pre-invasive cases, the data for this last group is equally flamboyant and looks as if it's a 0. If we move on, this is their interpretation. We observed a substantial reduction in cervical cancer incidence, CIN3, in young women after the introduction of HPV immunization, especially in individuals who were offered the vaccine at age 12 to 13 years. They allowed themselves in Lancet speak. This last comment, next one. The HPV immunization program has successfully almost eliminated cervical cancer in women born since September the 1st, 1990. Let's move on. This animation comes from the WHO, and it shows up to 2018 how the vaccination has spread. So you can see it starts in the countries that least need it, and then gradually begins to spread to reach reasonable levels. America started very early, but the refuseniks were highest in the United States, so it only hit 40–50%. Australia, very high adopter, as is the United Kingdom. France has now started early, but has the highest rate of non-acceptance of the vaccine. Okay, let's remember that, and now look at the map as to where we find cervical cancer. All the countries that are getting it are the ones that need it least of all. So there is a WHO problem. We've got to get the vaccine to the right part of the world. And in November of last year, if I have the next slide, this was said by Tedros at the initiation of the WHO Global Initiative to accelerate the elimination of cervical cancer. What he said was eliminating any cancer would have once seemed an impossible dream. But we now have the cost-effective, evidence-based tools to make that dream a reality. But going back to Valerie Goodell, if I go to the last slide, it really is an excuse for me to show my favorite picture from the portfolio. Let's convert the images we saw of her to maybe someone who has had to undergo treatment, who is looking still a bit warm and so delicately painted in the pastel colors that she so loved. But actually, she's described as a convalescent, somebody who is recovering, not somebody who's facing the fate of Valerie